Got it.
Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, and I'm here with David Maxwell, who is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces. See, I practiced that and I still messed up. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, and I'm here with David Maxwell, who is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel and has spent more than 30 years in Asia as a practitioner specializing in Northeast Asian security affairs and irregular, unconventional, and political warfare. He is a senior advisor to the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy and a senior fellow at the Global Peace Foundation. Hello, Dave. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Anita. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate so much and bringing on kind of a new topic that we haven't discussed as much, but it's certainly something that is close to me, having spent so much time in South Korea. So to begin with, last week, North Korea put on a military parade featuring its nuclear capabilities and intercontinental ballistic missiles. It received very little coverage in the United States. Instead, attention was understandably focused on the Chinese spy balloon and other unidentified objects being shot down over the United States and Canada. I point this out because out of the many potential threats to the United States, many feel that North Korea is not a particularly urgent or immediate problem to address. How would you describe the threat from North Korea, and should Americans be paying more attention to it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's only logical that we would focus on the balloon so much. I look at North Korea as the fourth of the five major threats that our national security outlines. The pacing item, of course, is China, Putin's war in Ukraine, and then of course Iran is poses a big threat in the Middle East. I think we look at North Korea really as the fourth, and then the ongoing threat of violent extremist organizations. So when you look at all of those, we tend to compartmentalize North Korea as a little different. It is isolated. It is, in this little peninsula, which is, unusual in that North Korea is connected to all the other threats. And I think we overlook that. North Korea, of course, is a threat to South Korea, a threat to Japan. And as we saw in the parade last week, has developed an ICBM capability, and perhaps most troubling, some analysts suspect that they showed off a solid fuel rocket for an ICBM, which will complicate our defensive capabilities and our indications and warning to the launch of an ICBM. So it can threaten, it does threaten the United States, but its other activities are really troubling as well. Of course, China and North Korea have the only alliance both those countries have, so they work in a cooperative manner, although not lockstep. Kim Jong-un has shown support for Putin in his war in Ukraine, to include today in the Wall Street Journal report from CSIS showing imagery of trains traveling to Russia, purportedly carrying ammunition to support the Russians in Ukraine. But beyond those physical and geographic relationships, we see North Korea conducting cyber activities around the world, whether it's the Bitcoin markets, whether it's phishing, hacking attack, holding health facilities hostage, with malware, and all kinds of attempts to steal money to support the regime. And then we have its other activities, which include drug trafficking, methamphetamines, counterfeiting of drugs, to include Viagra, counterfeiting of cigarettes, money laundering, overseas slave labor, and one of the worst is counterfeiting $100 bills. I mean, we have changed our $100 bills because of the capabilities of North Korea to counterfeit. In fact, I heard a Treasury Department official jokingly say, but with some truth, that the way they can tell a counterfeit North Korean bill is that it's actually better than an American produced bill. And so it just is an indication of their capabilities to counterfeit. So all of these things, North Korea is connected to, of course, missile proliferation to Iran, nuclear proliferation to Syria. Thankfully, the Israelis destroyed the nuclear plant in 2007 that was being constructed in Syria. And then, of course, proliferation of all kinds of weapons and training to conflict zones, primarily in Africa and the Middle East. Yemen, the Scuds, I think that Iran provides to Yemen come from North Korea, that they fire into Saudi Arabia. So I say all that because North Korea is connected to so much and so many of our other national security interests around the world. And then, of course, if something happens on the peninsula, whether it's war, whether North Korea attacks South Korea, or whether the regime collapses and there's internal instability that results in conflict and humanitarian suffering on a scale we haven't seen in decades, it will affect the second and third largest economies in the world, China and Japan. The two nuclear powers in the region, Russia and China. Of course, North Korea is a rogue nuclear power. And then the amount of military forces, South Korea's army, China, Russia, Japan's military capabilities, and of course, the U.S. presence in the region. I mean, there is potential for conflict there that will have global implications. And then, of course, the relationship between China and Taiwan unification, North and South unification. If China does something in Taiwan, will North Korea lash out and take advantage of that, or vice versa? I think people forget that in 1950, when North Korea attacked South Korea, the first move that we made, military move, was to send the Seventh Fleet into the Straits, into South China Sea and the Straits of Taiwan there. So, all of this is related. However, I lay down all these threats. We are also a victim of our success. Although the war has never ended in Korea, we have an armistice that was signed 70 years ago this July. The fact is, hostilities have not resumed. We've been successfully deterring the resumption of hostilities for 70 years. And that success breeds complacency and, things like out of sight, out of mind. We only really focus on North Korea when it conducts a provocation. And in fact, going back to the parade, although they showed us apparently the largest number of missile launchers and perhaps a new ICBM, everyone focused on the fact that Kim Jong-un's daughter was put out front there, and so I think that people are tired of the military and saw something different. We've seen a few reports over the last few months of his daughter Kim Ju-ae being front and center, and now all the speculation turns to succession. Is she going to follow? Is she being groomed for succession? And of course, she's apparently the second child, and we think that the first child is a son, and that leads to a lot of questions on why and how. I personally think it's premature to talk about succession, although historically, for a precedent, Kim Il-sung did designate Kim Jong-il his successor in 1974, and he had 20 years to consolidate his power. And of course, when his father died in 1994, he took over. The difference is that we don't think that Kim Jong-il designated Kim Jong-un as his successor maybe 2 to 3 years before he passed. And so Kim Jong-un never had the time to consolidate his power, which is probably one reason why we've seen so many purges and violent purges, which is, I think, an effort to consolidate his power and rid the regime of any potential opposition. So a long way of saying is Korea is often out of sight, out of mind, but it's a very real threat that we need to pay attention to and to be prepared for. And it is connected globally to all of our interests.
You make so many great points there that I want to follow up on, but I really appreciate the way that you talk about the interconnection of North Korea and many of the ongoing conflicts, because I think that doesn't get talked about or enough focus on the activities other than its nuclear program, although that's a lot of what I have to ask you about. So I first visited the North Korean border in 1999, and it feels like little has changed over that time period, except for the gradual and incremental progress of North Korea's nuclear program. Negotiating directly with North Korean leaders hasn't worked to halt or denuclearize North Korea's weapons program. Multilateralism, such as the six-party talks under George W. Bush, hasn't worked. Neither economic incentives nor sanctions have altered the status quo. Both ignoring North Korea and giving it global attention have produced the same results. It feels like an intractable problem. Before I ask you about what the U.S. can and should be doing about it, I want to talk about the end goals for a strategy on North Korea. Is denuclearization realistic? Are there more achievable goals the U.S. should be focusing on?
That's a great question. What is our end state, or as Lieutenant General Jim Dubik would say, what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement that will serve, protect, and advance our interests in Northeast Asia? I agree wholeheartedly. Kim Jong-un is not going to give up nuclear weapons. They are critical to every aspect of his rule and survival of the regime. He has no intention of it, and there is no way that we will be able to negotiate and use. There are no carrots and there are no sticks that will cause him to give up his nuclear weapons. So I think that's a realization that I think many people are coming to. But denuclearization, of course, is a worthy goal. We don't want the peninsula to be nuclearized. And in fact, North and South Korea in 1992 signed the agreement on denuclearization. And that's where the term has come from in the Korean context, that agreement. And they agreed to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. And of course, people forget that the U.S. had nuclear weapons in Korea, and in support of that agreement, the U.S. removed them. So there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, despite what North Korean rhetoric says. However, and then of course, you also ask, are there other things that we can pursue? We are, I think, trying to pursue an element of containment, trying to contain North Korea's capabilities, its growth, and of course, its ability to attack South Korea. And so I think that is ongoing, and that's really part of managing the problem and preventing things from getting worse. But as you correctly noted, they incrementally and sometimes by leaps and bounds improve their military capabilities, at least their advanced ones in terms of missile and nuclear capabilities. And so what can we really seek to achieve? Recently, Ambassador Robert Joseph led a working group, which I was part of, and we've published a new proposal, a strategy that we should really focus on. And it is on the realization that Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons. And what we really need, and the conventional wisdom is denuclearization and then unification. And I mention unification because every president since Lee Myung-bak and Barack Obama have said peaceful unification is the goal. And Obama and Lee Myung-bak, President Park and President Obama, President Trump and President Moon said that South Korea will take the lead in achieving peaceful unification. And so all the presidents since 2009 have said unification is the key. But we have always thought of denuclearization first, unification later. What we really need to focus on is reversing that conventional wisdom and realize that we are not going to achieve denuclearization nor an end to the crimes against humanity and the horrendous human rights abuses that are taking place in the North until there is unification, a free and unified Korea. One that is secure, stable, economically vibrant, non-nuclear, and governed by a liberal constitutional form of government, based on freedom, liberty, free market economy, and human rights. And so that's really the acceptable, durable political arrangement that is going to bring about the conditions for peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, there's a lot to talk about how to get there, and that's a big part of the problem. But our new strategy proposes that as really the end state, and it also proposes that we need to take a human rights upfront approach, and we need to have a sophisticated information and influence campaign against the North, focusing on the multiple target audiences from the regime, the elite military leadership, the second-tier leadership, those military leaders outside of the core that have power, significant power, and often control elements of weapons of mass destruction. And then, of course, the general population, the Korean people who live in the North. And of course, we have been reluctant to wage an information campaign. And in fact, because of Kim Jong-un's actions and his sister Kim Yo-jong in 2021, they coerced South Korea into banning information operations. The so-called anti-leaflet law was passed to stop South Korea from sending balloons into North Korea, particularly from the escapees who have been doing that for years. And this is because something that we tend to overlook. But Dr. Jung Pak, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asia Pacific, and the Deputy to Sung Kim, who is Ambassador Sung Kim, who is the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, she often asks this question: who does Kim Jong-un fear the most, the U.S. military or the Korean people living in the North? And the answer is the Korean people living in the North, especially when armed with information. Information is an existential threat to Kim Jong-un. And so that is why in June of 2021, Kim Yo-jong threatened to blow up the South Korean liaison building inside North Korea in the Kaesong industrial complex. She threatened, and then she ordered it to be executed, and they blew it up. And 6 months later, South Korea passed the anti-leaflet law, coerced by North Korea into appeasing their demand to stop information flow. So this is a real indication of what the threat is to Kim Jong-un and how important information is for the Korean people in the North. And so we really look, instead of focusing on denuclearization as the goal, we really need to focus on unification. And of course, people will rightly say, well, a free and unified Korea means there's no more Kim Jong-un. And yes, that's correct. Kim Jong-un is the root of all evil. The regime is the root of all evil on the Korean Peninsula, and that is what is holding up any long-term peace that is really necessary for the Korean Peninsula.
That's such a fascinating answer, and I have so many questions about it. So many. But before I want to go to your earlier point and talk a little bit about what the U.S. is doing. So last month, South Korean President Yoon mentioned in an offhanded sort of way the possibility that South Korea could get its own nuclear arms if the security situation with North Korea worsens. No one truly foresees that possibility, but it was taken to be a signal to the Biden administration that Seoul is not satisfied with how the U.S. is dealing with the North Korean threat. What's the current state of affairs regarding U.S. actions on North Korea? What is the Biden administration doing to address this challenge, and what more can be done to alleviate South Korea's fears?
Well, that's a very important question, and there's a lot to that. To give you the short answers, next week will be the first tabletop exercise that will be conducted between South Korea and the United States on response to North Korean nuclear weapons. Of course, we've reactivated the Extended Deterrence Working Group, going back to the security consultative meetings that took place in December. And of course, what people both in South Korea and the United States seem to overlook or not remember or misremember maybe is last year North Korea conducted more missile tests than ever before, more than 70 missile launches. And during that time, the United States multiple occasions deployed strategic assets to the region, carrier battle groups. We even redeployed a carrier battle group, but many strategic assets to the region, to Guam, to Japan, and to South Korea. We have reinvigorated our exercise program. Coming off of the decision in 2018 to cancel, postpone, and scale back exercises because the previous president said they were too expensive and worthless, and wanted to support diplomacy, thinking that appeasing Kim Jong-un with stopping exercises would make him come to agreement. And then, of course, COVID struck, so readiness declined in the combined military force. But this past year, we have reinvigorated the exercise program and really built it up. And although we conduct exercises all year long, we are now forecasting exercises over the next 6 months. We'll conduct more than 20 combined exercises. And we are forecasting that to show that readiness, sustained readiness, is the normal condition, that we are not reacting to North Korea's actions. We are sustaining readiness at all times. And so what is really important is that President Yoon and President Biden have laid the foundation for deterrence and defense. That high level of readiness of our combined military force is essential for any other actions that we take. So that's one area that where we are dealing with this the situation now. South Korea and other countries, other allies, look at U.S. actions and have become concerned, whether it is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, our slow start with supporting Ukraine. They question our commitment. Now, those two examples are apples and oranges from our commitment in Korea. But the fact is, people interpret those activities in their own interest. And so people get concerned. We should never forget that we are fully committed to South Korea, and 28,500 troops on the peninsula is a blood commitment to the defense. But again, we're also a victim of our success for deterring war for 70 years. And those 28,500 troops are just part of the landscape now in South Korea, and often overlooked as the real commitment. And so that does cause some problems, and leads to these decisions. Now, the other thing is that President Yoon is rightly concerned and committed to the defense of South Korea. And so he is looking at the threat from the north, and he wants to do everything he can. And so I think that his call for South Korea developing nuclear weapons is a response to the surveys of where 76%, I think in the last survey, of South Koreans say they should have their own, or at least consider their own, nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. I think President Moon, though, is acting shrewdly. I think they want U.S. nuclear weapons back on the peninsula as a deterrent. And so my guess, and the recent report that Victor Cha at the Center for Strategic International Studies just published, said, although their report was pre-decisional, which I thought was interesting from a think tank, and that is not a government think tank, but it said that we should consider restationing U.S. nuclear weapons in Korea, but that's pre-decisional. And I think what might be in the offing is that in return for South Korea not developing nuclear weapons, that we eventually agree to putting nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, which is problematic in its own right. And they're not only going to need to have tabletop exercises for responding to North Korean nuclear threat, they're also going to have tabletop exercises dealing with the protests that will take place in South Korea. I mean, when we had nuclear weapons in South Korea, we had some 90 installations. So who knows where those nuclear weapons were? There's only about 6 right now, and really only about 2 places where you could locate them. And so the current protests that take place 24/7 in Songju, where the THAAD battery is located, those will take place on a much greater scale by anti-nuclear, anti-US, and agitators from the north. So there will be protests that will take place on a significant level, and we'll need to be prepared for that. Now, I think President Yoon is acting in good faith. I believe the US will act in good faith to reinforce our commitment. I think that's the bottom line of both presidents, is to ensure our combined commitment to the defense of South Korea. However, North Korea, of course, its goals are, of course, survival of the regime, unification of the peninsula under domination of Kim Jong-un, under the rule of the guerrilla dynasty and Gulag state of North Korea. And the key condition that it needs to be successful is splitting the ROK-US alliance and getting US troops off the Korean Peninsula. Now, I look at North Korea's threats over the last year and its actions really driving President Yoon to want to develop nuclear weapons or reintroduce US nuclear weapons. That could be part of Kim Jong-un's political warfare strategy to undermine the alliance. This has created friction over, at least in public. I'm confident that our diplomats are really working through this, and if anything, our alliance will be stronger for what is happening. But from Kim Jong-un's perspective, I wonder if he thinks that he can create this energy in South Korea, this demand for nuclear weapons, as a way to undermine the ROK-US alliance, because there are many ways to interpret it. It appears a lack of US commitment. It appears, South Korea is going rogue, and the US won't tolerate it. And so there's many ways that this could play out. Again, I'm confident that that's not going to happen, but I think we should try to recognize that Kim Jong-un is conducting a political warfare strategy, a big part of which is to subvert South Korea and to subvert the ROK-US alliance. And of course, in understanding and dealing with the threat from the North with any adversary, first we must recognize their strategy. We must understand their strategy. We must expose their strategy to inoculate the people in South Korea and the United States to the strategy. And then we must attack that strategy, and not kinetically, but with information and influence. And so, it's recognize, understand, expose, and attack. Sun Tzu said, what is of supreme importance is to attack the enemy's strategy. And we need to do that. And by exposing it, we can lessen the political impact of the North strategy and overcome some of the political friction that's generated in both our countries that occurs when people don't understand what the North is doing. And instead, they use the North's activities for partisan political purposes, which of course weakens our national security. And so these are the things that we really must focus on. The other thing is that the Biden administration's policy is really pretty simple. Principled and practical diplomacy. They're willing to talk anywhere, anytime, without preconditions. But of course, Kim Jong-un is not willing to do so. They, resting on stern deterrence, which I've talked about, and the full implementation of all UN Security Council resolutions, which does mean if they're fully implemented, then North Korea must denuclearize. And so denuclearization is part of the UN Security Council resolutions. And so this is really and of course, the last is, strengthening the alliance and ensuring that it is strengthened, which goes to the deterrent aspect, of course. So principled and practical diplomacy, stern foundation of deterrence, full implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions. And that's really the Biden policy in a nutshell. Now, it will not work because, it takes two to tango. And Kim Jong-un is unwilling to negotiate. And why is that? He demands appeasement. He demands lifting of sanctions. And I credit President Moon and President Trump and President Biden and President Yoon for not lifting sanctions, even though the North is in many ways successfully evading sanctions with complicity from China and Russia. The fact that he told his elite and his military that he would be able to get sanctions lifted after they were imposed in 2017, that he could play Moon and Trump, his failure to get sanctions relief is really one of the biggest failures of the regime. I've talked to escapees who say that this is really undermining his legitimacy more than anything else. And so it is important that we hold firm on not lifting sanctions. And to do so would cause Kim Jong-un to assess that his political warfare strategy and blackmail diplomacy, which is the use of threats, increased tensions and provocations to get political and economic concessions, he would view those strategies as a success. And rather than come to the negotiating table and negotiate in good faith as a responsible member of the international community, he would say, why change? If my strategy is successful, if I'm able to coerce and extort the South and the US to get what I want, why would I change? And so that's why it's really important that we don't give in to that blackmail diplomacy.
Yeah, there's so much there. One thing I was thinking as you were talking was that if nuclear weapons were to return to the Korean peninsula, to South Korea, it's not just South Korean protests that would be a major issue, I think, but also China. How do you think China would react? And then there's this whole, problem of the intensity of tensions between the US and China. China plays a huge role in being able to address the North Korean problem. And can we really adequately do much about it if we cannot get China on board with any of our plans?
Yeah, I think first, the bottom line is we cannot expect China to solve the security issues of South Korea and the United States. I think we should understand that. I think you are very correct. China will protest in such a way, primarily against South Korea, that they did with the THAAD issue. They will conduct aggressive economic warfare if we put nuclear weapons on it. They will try to punish South Korea. So we need to be prepared for that. We are going to have an economic response, and hopefully Quad and AUKUS and the other Asian countries that we can overcome the damage that China will try to inflict on South Korea. 25% of South Korean trade is with China. Another 25% is with the four Quad countries, and then the other 50% is with the rest of the world. So, we are going to have to be able to deal with that loss of the 25% for South Korea. So I think that's likely. China will certainly protest and be very upset with, and they will blame South Korea, I think, and indirectly, of course, the United States. But China is not going to, first of all, I think it's a myth to think that China controls North Korea. They are, the alliance that is supposedly closer than lips and teeth. Their alliance goes back to 1963, but of course, the Chinese People's Volunteers, saved North Korea for Kim Il-sung. But I think that the other thing is that all three Kims, particularly Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il to a certain extent, have effectively played the superpowers against each other. Kim Il-sung manipulated Mao and Stalin to be able to attack South Korea. And so I think we have to think about North Korea in that vein. They are not really allied with anybody. They're not beholden to anybody. Their Juche ideology really emphasizes their independence and strength, being able to stand up to anyone, to include China and Russia if need be. And so China, cannot really control North Korea. Now, it could, because China over the years, I look at it as a barometer. As international aid goes up, Chinese aid declines. As international aid goes down, Chinese aid, increases. Because I think what China wants, and we've heard this articulated as the three no's, they want no war on the Korean Peninsula, no instability and regime collapse, and no nuclear weapons. Well, they're batting 600. They're a pretty good baseball team. They got 2 out of the 3 so far. But nuclear weapons to China, I do not think are viewed in the same way as we view the nuclear threat. I've heard from Chinese scholars that they don't believe that North Korea would use nuclear weapons on China, that it's not a threat to them. Although, they do express concern with loose nukes and the like, but it's not the same kind of threat. So they don't have the incentive to solve that problem. They want to have no war and they want to have no instability and collapse, but they can live with the nuclear weapons. And now they could coerce North Korea, and they could cut off aid and support for North Korea. But that could lead to instability and collapse. On the other hand, we've just seen since 2020 in COVID, the closing of trade, both legal trade and illicit activities between North Korea and China, and North Korea continues to muddle through. So North Korea is able to absorb tremendous amount of hardship and and terrible conditions, and still continue to muddle through and survive. So I don't know if even fully cutting off all of Chinese support would really affect the regime's decision making. And I also look at use this analogy to describe the relationship. North Korea is like a drowning child. It's got a failed economy. It's in a tough neighborhood. It's never going to be able to recover using its current system. So it's a drowning child. And China is like a lifeguard with a life ring. And it tosses that life ring to the drowning child and allows it to keep its head above water. But it refuses to reel it into safety. And I think that's really the way the situation is, because they want to keep North Korea as that buffer. They want to keep, U.S. and democratic forces off of its border. And so it wants to maintain the status quo for as long as possible. And, there is some irony that all of our interests are aligned. None of us want war. That's, when you really think about it, okay, let's all prevent war. That's good. Now, we all have different ways that we go about doing that, but that we're not in agreement, but we don't want war. The other thing too is regime collapse, which I could talk to in detail here, but instability and collapse is going to be catastrophic, and it's unlikely to occur without some level of conflict. And so it's not going to be a benign event like East and West Germany. And so we need to, people who wish for collapse, I think, could be mistaken. Back in the 90s, we were really concerned with it during the arduous march, the famine of 94 to 96. And we worried about it very much. We wrote a con plan, 29, to try to deal with it. But they didn't collapse. And they didn't collapse because the election of Kim Dae-jung, the Sunshine Policy, transferred billions of dollars to the regime. And it also didn't collapse because of the growth of markets. When the public distribution system failed, markets evolved. To this day, there's some 400 markets in the North, and primarily run by women. Women really became the breadwinners and those keeping their families together. And so that is really what has been resilient for North Korea for the last 2 decades. The problem now is that with COVID, Kim Jong-un has really cracked down on all aspects of society, to include markets, placing great restrictions on them, trying to police up all the foreign currency, which most of the market activity is done in dollars and RMB and euros, and they're cracking down on information, communications, on movement, and of course they closed the border with China to trade. So there is really no safety valve, no way out for the people. And so the potential for instability, I think, now is greater than it was in the 1990s. And combined with the fact that now North Korea has nuclear weapons, instability and collapse could be very, very dangerous. And we just saw reports that they've reduced the food ration, from 640 grams down to 500 grams to include in the military. And some of the winter training cycle was canceled because some of the units could not feed their troops sufficiently. But yet they'll spend a month preparing for a parade on February 8th, as they did. They're really, the regime is just, bankrupt in more than one way. And it's really a terrible situation up there, but I'll stop there.
Also, I want to follow up on that. And I know you're well of that. Typically, when regimes are overthrown, they're more usually replaced by dictators or prolonged internal violence, which is what you've been speaking about. Can this be prevented in North Korea, or should we just expect a period of instability?
Well, yes, we must plan for it. I think we have to, because the nature of the system is such that, from Kim Il-sung's time, they have built this system that is about keeping the regime in power, keeping one person in power. And so the Songbun system, which is the social classification system, 51 classes of society that are divided basically into the elite, the wavering middle class, not economic middle class, but the middle classes, and then the disloyal classes at the bottom. And so this social classification system is really designed to prevent any kind of collective action, any kind of conspiracy, And the security services are such that, the party's security services are such that you cannot speak disloyally in any way to anyone about the regime. They have, as a typical communist country, they have their weekly confession sessions every week that the local populace will meet and confess to the Inmenbom, the local political leaders, which of course they use for their rule by law. That when they want to incarcerate somebody, they take their pre-confessions that they've given at their weekly sessions. But this is all designed to prevent any kind of conspiracy or collective action. And because, if you and I were having this conversation, when we're done, we would report what the other one had said, both to protect ourselves and to get, credit from, for doing that. And that's something that is really, really difficult for us to understand. But it is designed to prevent any kind of overthrow. And so what that means is there's unlikely to be a successor. And of course, in their party documents, in their constitution, there is no succession mechanism. It is dynastic. And, in the two succession mechanism events that have taken place have been orchestrated by the regime, pre-planned. And so, but there's no documentation, no authority directing that. It's only the leader that does that. And so we're not likely to see. And of course, the question I always ask national security officials is, what if we learned today that Kim Jong-un was dead? What actions would we take? Because if with no succession mechanism, and if they have not done that, it's unlikely that it will be stable for very long. The process is when the leader dies, they lock down the country, prevent all movement, they recall all party officials to a certain level to Pyongyang, and they have the meeting to choose the new leader. Well, the new leader is always preordained, or has been. If that hasn't been done, then there's no process for reconciling that, and that's where we're going to see conflict. From within Pyongyang, and then if there's the inability to manage the military and security services, we could see people start to fend for themselves, and those core commanders throughout may become de facto warlords, using their military power to survive. And so conflict is very likely to occur. And there's all different ways of that things could evolve. That conflict could arise among the military first if the regime is unable to provide resources to all the military. If they start cutting off military units from supply, from resources, then those military units may take action on their own to continue to survive. And so, when that happens, we really are on the path to regime collapse. And just to put things in perspective for those who think about this, Robert Collins, who's a longtime strategist in Korea, retired now, but when we were working on 5029, he really described the 7 phases of collapse, which he articulated based on long study of regime collapses around the world. But we came up with a definition to really describe collapse specifically to North Korea. And that is when the party loses central governing effectiveness, the ability to govern the entire North Territory from Pyongyang, combined with the loss of coherence and support of the military. Those two conditions, when they happen, that's when Kim Jong-un and the regime will no longer be able to govern. And what happens after that is potentially, very chaotic, and, internal infighting, chaos, civil war, but the loss of central governing effectiveness and the coherence and support of the military, that is what is going to bring about regime collapse. The problem with that is when those conditions are emerging and Kim Jong-un observes them, he may determine that his only option is to execute his campaign plan to unify the peninsula under his rule in order to ensure survival. Many people say that the survival of the regime is the goal. So why don't we just buy him off and send him to a villa in China? He doesn't want that kind of survival. He wants to survive as the leader, as the head of North Korea, and ultimately the leader of a unified Korea under his control.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a realistic but pretty scary scenario. I'd be interested to hear what the national security officials tell you about that. Do you
Most
worry? Oh,
every
sorry.
answer is, well, we'll wait and see, which is what we've done. We'll see how conditions develop.
Yeah.
And my response to that is perhaps we should be ready to reach out. Perhaps we should, and ultimately what we really want to do is observe for emerging leaders. And our information and influence program really needs to focus on a couple things, many things, but one of them is for the military leaders. If you don't attack the South, then you'll have a place in a unified Korea. That's one important point there. But for emerging leaders, whoever might emerge, they should know that the South and the U.S. are willing to talk, provide support, and negotiate for the safety of the emerging leader and the entire country of the North. And so our information program needs to be focused on that rather than what is normally done now by the escapees, which is a lot of insulting of the regime, a lot of telling how bad they are, which that's all true. But we really need to focus on information that is articulating policy and articulating the future. What is a unified Korea going to look like? What does land ownership look like? How
Mhm.
are you going to be integrated into the economic and political system of a unified Korea? All those things are really important, and we should be focused on that kind of influence and information going into North Korea.
Yeah, I think you make really important points, and I really think of that, particularly when you talk about the information influence campaign being a lot more than just saying, oh, North Korean dictatorship is bad, the West has freedom and things of that nature. But I think it's really important to prepare for that chaos and to to make sure that any potential successors in that sort of contested arena would know that they could have these policy options. Although it seems to me that there would be other penalties maybe for them if they're seen working too closely with the US and South Korea. I find your idea, and that along with your working group that you were part of, about that the goal should be, if instead of denuclearization, which is not going to happen under the Kim regime, a free and unified Korea. But my sense is that reunification seems just as difficult for several reasons. Leaving aside overthrowing the Kim regime, there is the overwhelming cost of reunification. Who pays for that? It's clear that South Korea alone would be unable to foot the bill. Then there's the South Korean people themselves who are not enthusiastic about the idea of reunification. And finally, there's China, which would probably do anything they can, maybe even war, to stop the US from having troops on their border. How do you think these challenges can be overcome?
Great question. Let me take the last one first. I think that China, although it wants to maintain the status quo, I think has accepted the fact that unification comes, it will be a free and unified Korea under the Republic of Korea. So it'll be a united Republic of Korea. You are okay. You rock. That's that will be the future. I think China accepts that, and I say that because one is that China is already making plans to exert influence over the peninsula, economic influence. They are taking out 50 and 100-year leases of mineral rights throughout North Korea. And my belief is they're doing that so that when unification occurs, that they'll be able to say to the Koreans that we've made these agreements and we want them honored. We made them with Koreans, and your constitution, South Korea, which now is the dominant one, says that all of Korea is sovereign Republic of Korea territory, and all Koreans are citizens of the Republic of Korea. And so they will argue that we made agreements with your citizens and we want them honored. That's one. Second is, I think that China's real long-term goal is along the lines of what you said. They want U.S. forces off the peninsula, off the Asian landmass. I think that is their goal, and so I think they're going to posture to do that. Now, I don't think that I believe that they don't want war to make that happen, but I think they want to do that. The irony is, though, that who will demand U.S. forces off the peninsula most of all? It'll probably be the American people. When there's a unified Korea, they'll say, why do we need them there? And the demands to bring home troops will come from the United States. Now, what I tell my Korean friends is that what you should do with China is not negotiate away our presence. I've heard some pundits in the U.S. say, we should tell China when there's unification, we'll go home. I don't believe we should say that. I believe that South Korea and the United States should say the future presence of U.S. troops will depend on the security situation in the region. And so if the security situation warrants, we won't need troops there. But if it does, then we're prepared to sustain the alliance. And so what I would like to do is to present that to the Chinese, here are the options. And maybe that will moderate their behavior. But I don't believe China wants to absorb North Korea. They would be an occupier, which goes against, Chinese, and they just would not want that that headache because there's no love between the Chinese people and the Korean people, the North Korean people, and so I think we should understand that. So that I think China will not support unification, but there will be acquiescence to it if it believes it can achieve its long-term objective, getting U.S. forces off the peninsula. Now, to South Korea, yes, expensive. I think South Koreans have probably done more PhD dissertations on East and West German unification than any other. They're certainly concerned with that. And we look at the huge disparity between North and South. And I think people make assumptions that we will see the immediate attempt to increase the GDP or the personal income of people to make it equitable between North and South. And that's not going to happen right away. You're not going to give $40,000 to each Korean family in the North, the per capita income. You're not going to equalize that right away. And so there's there are going to be tremendous costs, but they need to be planned for. And I think there are ways to mitigate the cost and really come out on the other side. As former President Park Geun-hye, the impeached President Park Geun-hye, used to say, unification as a bonanza. When there are 85 million Koreans with the industry of the South, the resources of the North, when it finally gets going, it's going to be an economic powerhouse, and it will really be a dominant country in the region and throughout Asia and the world. But we got to get there. And so all the fears that you articulated. Now, the Koreans in the South, yes, there is not a strong desire for unification, but you also can't prevent it either. Who is going to prevent it? I talked about the Chinese. I don't think anybody's going to intervene with force, whether it's Japan, who may not want unification, Russia, China, but also the Korean people in the South. If North Korea collapses or if there's war and North Korea is defeated, there is only one path, one outcome, and that's unification. You cannot leave the 25 million Koreans in the North, suffering on their own. After their country is devastated, either through collapse or war. Now, the good news is that South Korea has a Ministry of Unification. And I just happened to spend a week right before Christmas in Korea with the Ministry of Unification. And they are embarked on revitalizing their unification plans. In fact, they're going to release their new plans. It'll be onward toward unification, and unification on. Abbreviated UNION, UNION, or union, and so they're already preparing for that. Now, as I often, and so the Korean people, yes, they don't want unification, but they may have and I don't say they don't want unification. Most Koreans want unification. You ask somebody in their heart of hearts, they want them. But if you're asked your question, do you want to pay for unification? The answer is hell no. That's really, they don't want to interrupt, the good life that they have. And, people believe there are stark differences between North and South, although I would argue that the Koreanness, the spirit of the Han, the innate feeling of being Korean exists on both sides of the DMZ. And it's more aligned than people think. And I'll just give this quick anecdote. When Koreans suffer, they survive. But when given opportunities, they thrive. And we've really seen this. The hardship of the North for the last 7 decades, the people still survive. And in fact, when given the opportunities, we see how they have developed markets. And they have the capability to be entrepreneurial, just as the South Korean society had no democratic background, had no free market background. But after the war, the ashes of the Korean War, given the opportunity with security and over time, they developed the miracle on the Han. The 10th largest economy in the world, the only nation to go from a major aid recipient to a major donor nation, only OECD nation to do that. Soft power, K-pop, major shipbuilding, major nuclear power. I mean, South Korea is a major nuclear power, peaceful nuclear power, but 24 nuclear power plants, and they export nuclear power around the world. So all these things happened in North and South Korea, but underlying this is the spirit of Korea, the oneness, the spirit of the Han that exists on both sides. And so unification will be hard, and it will. But the Ministry of Unification is really embarking on planning for it, which is necessary. And I think that there's really no other alternative. Again, nobody's going to stand for a divided country with a wealthy and healthy South Korea and a starving population that could end up, at worse than Somalia, even, with no functioning government and just continued civil war inside. I don't think anybody will stand for that. And so I think South Korea will have to lead the intervention to bring peace and security and ultimately prosperity to the Korean Peninsula. And that's why unification is so important. Now, I believe South Korea should plan for unification overtly, publicly, and should lay out those plans for the world to see, especially the Koreans in the North. Even though I don't believe that peaceful unification will ever happen, because Kim Jong-un will not acquiesce. However, the peaceful unification plans are the most comprehensive, because peaceful unification is actually the most complex and difficult, because it requires the integration of two militaries, two economic systems, two political systems, and really two divergent cultures in many ways. But everything that is done for peaceful unification will apply in any other path to unification. So, for example, war is the quickest. Oh, hang on here. I got it. All right, that's my daughter calling. So war is the most likely path to unification, but its blood and treasure is something we don't want to expend. So we want to deter war. But if war occurs post-conflict, then you're going to take all the peaceful unification plans. That's going to be the basis for stability operations and ultimately achieving the political objective that is necessary for peace and prosperity. I've talked about regime collapse and instability and collapse. That's the second path, which will have some level of conflict, and how much conflict will be a function of Kim Jong-un and the military leaders. But that path ultimately will have to lead to unification. Now, the fourth path is the outlier, and that's emergent new leadership in North Korea. And this is what we really want to encourage, because we want to see new leadership emerge that will seek peaceful unification. And in that case, all the peaceful unification planning will take place. But whether there's regime collapse or war, most all of the peaceful unification planning will also apply after the conflict is brought to a halt. So unification is hard. Yes, it's going to be expensive. The other thing that the Ministry of Unification needs to work on is corporate investment, international investment, sharing its plans with the world so that people can see the opportunities that will exist. Because obviously, North Korean infrastructure is going to have to be rebuilt from ground up to international and modern standards. And that it will take huge investment, but the investment is also potentially in a generation or two going to pay off handsomely when they're. I mean, South Korea is already building these high-tech cities, and they are doing some tremendous work with technology. North Korea will end up being the foundation for. They will be able to build Pyongyang, Wonsan, Hamhung. All those cities will be able to be built in a modern way, and will end up being really probably the jewels of Northeast Asia. So, a lot of problems with a lot of challenges with unification, but also a lot of opportunity. But in the end, I think it's really the only path that is going to bring peace and prosperity. And so there needs to be a realistic look and a realistic effort to plan for that. And lastly, peaceful unification, that's the moral high ground. Yes, as I said, people will say, well, you're talking about regime change. We're not talking about regime change like Iraq and Afghanistan or Libya. We are talking about the outcome. And of course, the outcome is dictated in the paragraph 60 of the armistice. Paragraph 60 says that the parties should come together within 90 days of the signing of the armistice to solve the Korea question. And the Korea question is the unnatural division of the peninsula. There needs to be a political solution, and the only political solution is unification.
There's just a couple things that I want to push back just a little bit on. The economic challenges would be more come from, as it was in West Germany, from the influx of North Koreans who would prefer to live in South Korea. And suddenly you have this influx, even if they were to stay in North Korea, of cheap labor. So a lot of jobs moving from South Korea to North Korea. So it seems like there would be a lot of economic disruption that South Koreans really don't want to pay for. So two questions related to that is it really inevitable that South Korea would see the overthrow of Kim and choose to not let things play out in North Korea because of how South Koreans, the people themselves, would react? And kind of following up on that is, should the world, should at least the West, should the United States be coordinating closely in a reunification plan? Is there will, you think, in the West to truly create some sort of new economic pact that would help pay for these costs that no doubt would be incurred?
Yeah. So your first question, particularly about refugees, people coming south, I think people, certainly China fears that refugees from the north going into China. We've seen them reinforce their border with military and the like. Obviously, South Korea is, now the promised land for many in the north, with the economic vitality. However, we also have to look at human nature, and 33,000 escapees in South Korea. Many, if not most of them, want to go back to the north, not to go back to the regime, but to go back to their homes. People are attached to their homes. And so one of the important policies that South Korea must have in terms of unification is that when the unification process begins, people are going to have title to their land. They're going to own their land. They're going to own their apartments. And that is going to contribute to a stay put policy and help reduce the amount of refugee flow. Now, of course, there will be people that will want to come. They'll be attracted to that. However, many people will want to stay there. And so as part of the information influence program, people need to understand what owning land is all about, what a title to the land is, because now the regime owns everything, the party. And so they don't have that concept of land ownership. So they need to be educated on that. One of the things that I've long proposed to my Korean friends is that they need to create the dramas in South Korea, the entertainment shows that show what unification is going to be like. And they need to build programs, entertainment programs, showing the future, and so they can teach people about land ownership. And these will be subtle messages in terms of love stories and heartwarming stories, or all kinds of stories that can occur. That I'm sure you probably saw Crash Landing on You, the Netflix drama that took place. Koreans from the north who I've talked to very moved by that. And one of the things that really moved the soldiers that I talked to was the fact that they didn't portray the Koreans in the North as monsters, even the military, which of course upset conservatives in the South. But they were impressed by that. And these dramas have influence in the North. And so we need to teach people about land ownership. That's one of the ways to reduce the amount of refugees. And then, but there will be refugees, particularly to the South. And so South Korea has to prepare for that. Now, in terms of, international economic contributions, yes, I think that what the Unification Ministry has to do, working with its Ministry of Finance and Commerce, is to determine how investment opportunities are going to be managed in the North. Of course, you have the K-balls in the South, tremendous amount of resources, but also, there will be problems if they dominate everything as well. And so the South Korean government is going to have to manage how investment is going to occur. And we certainly want to encourage South Korea should want to encourage international investment, to include from Japan, and which of course has a whole other complication because of historical friction, but resources and so. But this is why South Korea though has to have the comprehensive plans, and the effort must be led by South Korea, the military effort and the political effort, and the economic effort. And they must share those plans so people can understand them and see how they can benefit from them. What kind of investment opportunities exist, and South Korea has to encourage that and create an investment environment where people will come in and, of course, gainfully employ Koreans from the North in those economic efforts. We've got to be very careful to prevent, the carpetbagger situation after the U.S. Civil War, where Northerners went to the South to take advantage of the South. That's got to be prevented by the South Korean government. But all that can be done with good planning ahead of time, transparent plans, and those plans can also generate confidence among the Korean people in the South and the international community that there is a sound plan that will reduce the problems. There's no plan that's going to eliminate. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a challenge. There will be continued suffering. It will be expensive, but good planning can mitigate all of that to a manageable level. Of course, no suffering or any suffering is not acceptable, but we have to face facts that there will be continued suffering for some time to come because this is a really, really complicated situation.
Well, thank you. This has been such a fascinating discussion, and I really like your new way of framing what the end goal should be. I think your take on informational warfare and influence is really intriguing, and that document from that working group with the 6 recommendations, I believe, will definitely be in our show notes. So
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, what we started out talking about, I think Korea is really important to the United States and really to the world. And while we hope and pray there's never war, we do have to be ready for it. And Korea does affect geostrategic thinking throughout the world. And so we can't let it, hide behind the moniker of the Hermit Kingdom. We've got to be prepared for dealing with what might really happen.
I just could not agree more. And it really echoes my own sentiments that I feel about Korea and what attention it's not getting. So thank you. It was such a comprehensive overview. You have a lot of interesting and new thoughts about it. And so I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. There's a stop button here somewhere. Recording.